I was the daughter my family used to hide after my divorce, the one they spoke about in lowered voices like I had ruined their name. Then I built a life so successful, they suddenly wanted me back, not as a daughter, but as the face of their comeback. They put my name on their biggest gala, smiled like we were healed, and expected me to stand there and save their reputation. What they didn't understand was that I hadn't come home to forgive them, and I definitely hadn't come home to be used again. Because when a family only remembers your worth after the world starts clapping for you, that isn't love. That's strategy. And what happened when I took that stage in front of everyone changed the story they thought they were telling forever. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, or share your thoughts after the story. And please like and subscribe so we can reach 1,000 subs and keep these stories coming. The first thing that found Naomi that morning was not an apology. It was a PDF. It arrived at 6:12 a.m., sliding into her inbox with the soft, bloodless efficiency of something that had been assembled by 3 careful people in a boardroom and approved by a 4th who never imagined she might see it before she was supposed to. Naomi was still in bed when her phone lit up on the nightstand, the room around her pale with that colorless pre-dawn light Chicago wore so well in late October. For a second, she thought it might be one of the overseas clients her firm occasionally handled. Then she saw the sender, Renee Solis. Naomi reached for the phone with the reflex of someone who had built a business by never letting the day get ahead of her. Renee did not send messages before 7 unless something mattered. You need to see this before anyone calls you, the message said. Below it was the attachment. Mercer and Wynn 50th Anniversary Renewal Gala featured family legacy speaker Naomi Mercer. Naomi sat up so quickly the duvet slipped to her waist. For a moment she only stared at the file name, Mercer and Wynn. The name sat there on the screen like a door she had sealed shut years ago and had somehow found open again. She opened the PDF. A cream and charcoal event deck appeared, polished and expensive looking in the way struggling companies often tried to be when they wanted to look stable. The first page showed a gold serif logo and a slogan so clean it felt almost moral. Built on family, restored by trust. Naomi's jaw tightened. She swiped to the next page, then the next. At the top of page 3, beneath a glossy rendering of a ballroom stage and a schedule for cocktails, dinner, and a legacy conversation, was her name. Not buried in small print, not mentioned in passing, centered. Featured family legacy speaker, Naomi Mercer, founder and managing principal, Mercer Rowan Advisory. Daughter of the Mercer family legacy, Naomi stopped breathing for one strange, suspended second. The city outside her bedroom windows was still quiet. Far below, along the river, the first commuter buses were beginning to move through the dark like slow-lit fish. Her apartment on the 22nd floor was all glass, stone, and deliberate calm. Nothing accidental, nothing inherited, nothing chosen by anyone but her. She had spent 12 years building a life that felt structurally sound. This room, this view, the Italian lamp in the corner, the framed abstract over the console, the navy cashmere throw folded at the foot of the bed. Every piece of it had been chosen by a woman who trusted her own taste because there had once been years when nobody else had trusted her judgment at all. And yet one line in one unauthorized event deck had reached all the way into that carefully built morning and put a crack through it. She read the line again, then once more, slower. Featured family legacy speaker, as if she had agreed to stand under stage lights and smile beside people who had once treated her life like a cautionary tale. As if family legacy was a phrase anyone in the Mercer household had ever allowed to include her after she walked out of her marriage at 26 with 2 suitcases, a legal folder, and the kind of silence that hums in your ears when humiliation has gone on too long. Naomi swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood. The hardwood felt cold under her feet. She walked barefoot into the kitchen, opened the espresso machine by touch, and set it running without taking her eyes off the phone. The machine hissed. Steam rose. Somewhere in another unit, a dog barked twice and was quiet again. She told herself to slow down. Read it like a professional first. Feel it later. So she did. The gala was set for 3 weeks out in Indianapolis. Crowley House Hotel. Black tie optional. A 50th anniversary event positioned as a renewal chapter for Mercer and Wynn, the family company that had once made handcrafted dining tables and custom millwork for luxury homes and boutique hotels across the Midwest before the market changed, and the company, from what Naomi had heard in fragments over the years, became the kind of place that still spoke in the language of heritage while quietly bleeding credibility. The deck was elegant. Too elegant. It had the brittle confidence of something designed to reassure investors and local press that nothing was wrong, which usually meant many things were wrong. And in the center of it, there she was. Naomi Mercer. Not Naomi Rowan, the name she had used professionally for years after deciding she no longer owed anybody easy access to her history. Not even the neutral special guest. They had chosen the old surname on purpose. Family legacy only worked if they could pin her back inside the frame. Her espresso finished pouring. She didn't touch it. Instead, she hit call. Renee answered on the second ring, already awake, already composed. Naomi could picture her clearly without trying. Dark hair cut blunt at the jaw, silver hoops, immaculate posture even at 6 a.m, the sort of still face that made people underestimate how quickly she saw everything. Renee had been with Naomi for 6 years, first as operations director, now as COO, and she possessed the rare gift of making competence look effortless without ever letting it feel casual. "Tell me this isn't real," Naomi said. "It's real," Renee replied. No wasted sympathy, no false softness. The deck came through one of the event consultants we know. She thought maybe you were doing a private advising engagement and wanted to confirm travel protocol before it went wider. Naomi shut her eyes. "They never contacted me." "I assumed that." The espresso machine clicked softly as it settled. Naomi finally picked up the cup, then set it back down untouched. "Has it been distributed?" "Not publicly, yet. But enough people have seen drafts that I'd treat it as live risk." That was why Renee mattered. She understood instinctively that this was not only personal, it was reputational, legal, narrative. Naomi's firm advised companies through structural trouble, financial reorganization, leadership crises, brand repair after internal failures. Her name carried weight because she had spent years making sure it meant judgment, discretion, and precision. If Mercer and Wynn wanted to drape that credibility over their event without permission, they were not merely trespassing emotionally. They were trying to borrow market trust. "I want to know who approved it," Naomi said. "I'm already working on that." Naomi let out a breath that barely qualified as one. There were people who thought anger arrived hot. In Naomi, it usually arrived cold. It cleared things, ordered them. Still, beneath that coldness, something older had begun to stir. Not grief exactly, not even rage. It was the more humiliating feeling underneath both, the sudden awareness that people who had once known exactly where to press could still find the outline of the bruise. She walked to the windows and looked down at the river. When she left Indianapolis 15 years ago, she had thought distance would convert memory into something manageable, and it had, mostly. Time had done its work. Success had done some too. She had built a firm with a reputation strong enough that private equity clients took meetings just to get on her calendar. She had learned how to sit at polished tables and speak in a voice that did not rush to justify itself. She had learned, more importantly, how not to explain the oldest wound in the room when no one had earned the right to hear it. But there were things that success did not cancel. It only placed them farther back, like old water stains behind fresh paint. Her family had spent years acting as if her divorce had not simply disappointed them, it had embarrassed them. There had been no scandal, no sensational betrayal, nothing dramatic enough to make a good story. That was almost worse. A plain failure left too much room for judgment. She had married a man who liked the performance of being a husband more than the reality of loving another human being. By the end, she had felt herself shrinking in rooms she paid for, apologizing for needs she could no longer name without feeling ridiculous. Leaving had been the first honest thing she had done in years. Her family had treated it like vandalism. They had not shouted, not in the cinematic way. The Mercers were too disciplined for scenes in front of the right people. What they did was smaller and more lasting. They rearranged their faces, spoke in lowered voices, introduced silence where comfort should have been. Naomi had become the woman everyone pitied with a trace of contempt, as though failing at marriage had revealed something unseemly in her character that had probably been there all along. And now, after all that, they wanted to put her on a stage, as proof, as restoration, as if the worst thing about what they had done was not that they had judged her, but that they had judged her too early, before it became inconvenient. "Naomi?" Renee said. "You still there?" "Yes. I can have Elias looped in within the hour." "Of course. Elias." Naomi looked toward the kitchen island where her planner lay open from the night before. The day ahead had been full before this. Client review at 9, lender call at 11, dinner with a hotel group from Denver. Normal problems. Professional problems, the kind that stayed where they belonged. "Yes," she said. "Get Elias. Do you want me to start with a cease and desist posture or information gathering first?" Naomi almost answered immediately. Instead, she looked again at her name on the page, at the phrase beneath it. Daughter of the Mercer family legacy. No, not daughter, not legacy, not theirs to place. Information first, she said quietly. I want to know how far they've gone. Renee paused just long enough for Naomi to know she understood. This was no longer only about unauthorized marketing language. Okay, she said, I'll call you at 8. The line clicked off. Naomi stood alone in the glass blue morning with her untouched espresso cooling beside her, the skyline slowly taking shape as daylight rose over the river. She should have showered. She should have dressed. She should have opened the binder for the client meeting and gone back to being the woman the city knew. Instead, she reopened the PDF. She studied the ballroom rendering this time, the stage, the lighting wash, the cream table linens, the huge printed backdrop with the Mercer and Wynn crest worked subtly into the design. Her name was there too, in one of the mock-ups, scripted along the lower corner in elegant lettering. It was a strange thing, seeing yourself arranged into someone else's story before they had even bothered to speak to you. That was when Naomi understood what disturbed her most. It was not the audacity, not even the insult. It was the assumption beneath it. Some part of her family still believed she could be moved into place. Chicago brightened around her by degrees. Naomi set the phone down, wrapped both hands around the espresso cup, and finally took a sip. It had gone slightly bitter. She drank it anyway, because sometimes the first thing a day gave you was the taste of exactly what it was going to be, and sometimes that was enough. By 9:30 that night, Chicago had turned itself into glass. The river below Naomi's windows held the city in broken ribbons, white, amber, red, and the office towers across from her looked sealed and expensive, their upper floors still lit by people who either loved what they did or no longer knew how to stop doing it. Her apartment was quiet in the way only a hard-earned home could be quiet. Not empty, not lonely, just undisturbed. The kind of quiet that asked nothing from her. Naomi stood at the kitchen island in stocking feet, one hand around a second cup of coffee she did not need, the other resting on the edge of the granite as if she were bracing against weather no one else could see. She had made it through the day, through the 9 o'clock review with a hospitality client in Denver, through a midday lender call that should have taken 40 minutes and took 90, through 2 rounds of messages from Elias and a clipped update from Renee confirming that no public version of the Mercer and Wynn deck had gone out yet. She had done everything correctly. She had answered in complete sentences. She had taken notes. She had made decisions people would bill generously for. She had even eaten half a salmon bowl at her desk sometime around 2, though she could not have said what it tasted like. But all day there had been something underneath it, running quietly under the surface of every thought. Not the gala, not even the theft of her name. The old sentence beneath it. Of course they used the wrong name for me. It was the only version of me they ever believed in. She took another sip and turned toward the windows. 15 years was enough time to turn almost anything into a narrative. That was one of adulthood's better tricks. You survived something, then you built enough life afterward that eventually you could tell the story in a way that made it sound shaped, contained, even useful. Naomi could do that now if she wanted. She could say that leaving her marriage at 26 had been the first disciplined choice of her adult life. She could say it taught her what loneliness inside a partnership actually felt like and how quickly women were asked to confuse endurance with character. She could say she had walked away with almost nothing because freedom was the only asset she trusted herself to value correctly at the time. All of that would have been true. It just wouldn't have been the whole truth. The whole truth was uglier in smaller ways. It was not the divorce itself that had changed the temperature of her life. It was what happened after, when she went home. Not home in the sentimental sense. The Mercer house had never really allowed sentiment unless it came dressed as pride, but home in the logistical sense. Indianapolis, the broad brick colonial on Meridian Kessler's quieter side streets, the one with the black shutters and the exact same brass knocker Naomi remembered from childhood, polished so regularly it always looked faintly judgmental. She had gone back because she was tired, because her lease in Columbus was ending, because she thought maybe 1 month under that roof would give her time to decide what came next. She had gone back because some stubborn, humiliating part of her still believed that if your life broke badly enough, your family would at least hand you a chair. Instead, they seated her in the wrong story. Naomi closed her eyes and let the memory come the way it always did, not as one clean cinematic scene, but in pieces. Light first, then texture, then the exact tone of someone's voice. The charity dinner had been at Hawthorne Club, an old money country club whose carpet smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wool. Naomi had grown up attending holiday brunches there, donor luncheons, foundation dinners, quiet little evenings where people with generational money congratulated one another for being tasteful. That particular night had been for a children's literacy fund, which had always struck Naomi as a special sort of irony, given how little curiosity most of those people had for lives unlike their own. She had not wanted to go. Vivian had insisted. "You can't hide forever," her mother had said from the doorway of Naomi's old bedroom, folding a cardigan over one arm. "People already know enough. Better they see you carrying yourself properly." That was Vivian's way. Not cruel in volume, cruel in framing. She could package almost any wound as advice on posture. At the time, Naomi had been 6 weeks out from signing the divorce papers. She was still sleeping badly, still waking with that strange, empty-limbed panic of someone whose future had been reduced to legal documents and practical questions. She had not yet learned that exhaustion made her too easy to persuade. So she went. She wore a navy dress she had owned before the marriage, one of the last things in her closet that still felt unmistakably hers. She remembered standing in front of the mirror in the upstairs bathroom, putting on earrings with hands that did not seem fully attached to her body, and thinking, if I can get through 3 hours, I can get through anything. She had underestimated the creativity of humiliation when practiced by people who believed themselves civilized. The ballroom at Hawthorne had been all ivory tablecloths and low floral arrangements, every surface arranged to suggest effortless abundance. Men in dark suits stood near the bar, talking in finance voices. Women in silk leaned into one another with the intimate alertness of people who lived on information and called it concern. Naomi remembered the first pause when she entered with her parents. It was small, barely measurable, but she felt it. Faces shifted, Not toward sympathy exactly, but toward recognition. There she was, the daughter who had come back, the marriage that had not lasted, the woman who had left before she could be left, which in that room somehow counted as both moral failure and social incompetence. Her father had introduced her 3 times that evening, and each introduction had been a lesson in how to wound a person without technically saying anything wrong. "This is my older daughter, Naomi," he had said to a banker whose wife immediately tilted her head in a way Naomi hated. "She's between things at the moment." Between things, as if a whole marriage could be filed beside delayed flights and temporary office renovations. Later, to a board member from one of the family's long-standing business charities, Dale had said, "She always was independent, sometimes too independent for her own good. A softer knife, sharper cut." And then, later still, the part Naomi remembered most clearly because it had changed something inside her. There had been the line he delivered to a pair of donors standing beside the silent auction table. He had been holding a lowball glass with exactly 2 fingers, his silver hair immaculate, his tuxedo fitting him with the authority of a man who had spent his whole life never being unsure where to stand. "This one is bright," he had said, glancing at Naomi with the detached amusement of someone evaluating stock that had underperformed. "But she never learned how to live in a way that makes people want to stay." The donors had laughed lightly, not because it was funny, but because wealthy people often laughed when they sensed a family truth being offered to them as entertainment. Naomi remembered one woman lowering her eyes immediately afterward, as if she knew enough to feel embarrassed for all of them, but not enough to interfere. Naomi had stood there for one impossible second, smiling on instinct, because women were trained to smile in the gap between injury and response. Then she had excused herself and walked toward the terrace. No one stopped her. That part mattered more than the line itself. Behind her, the dinner continued. Inside, forks lifted, chairs scraped. A server walked by carrying champagne flutes. Somewhere near the front of the room, someone tested the microphone for the donor remarks. Life did not halt for a woman's public diminishment, especially not if it was done elegantly. She stepped onto the terrace into sharp April air. Outside, the club's grounds rolled black and trimmed into the dark, interrupted here and there by low path lights. Naomi gripped the stone balustrade and breathed through her mouth because she could feel crying coming and would rather have swallowed glass than let it happen where anyone from that ballroom could see it. That was when Celeste found her. Her sister had been 23 then, all polished angles and easy radiance, the kind of beautiful that looked cooperative in photographs. Where Naomi had always moved like someone aware of her own interior life, Celeste moved like someone who had been rewarded early for understanding what other people wanted to see. She had their mother's honey-colored hair and none of her caution. At that age, she wore confidence the way some women wore perfume, generously, without ever questioning if the room could take it. Naomi had hoped briefly that Celeste had come out to be kind. Instead, she leaned one shoulder against the terrace door and said, "You can't make that face in there." Naomi turned slowly. "What face?" "That one." Celeste gave a tiny circular gesture near her own mouth, as if grief were a smudge Naomi had failed to blend correctly. "The wounded thing, people are already talking." Naomi stared at her. Somewhere inside the ballroom, applause started and died. "I'm not doing anything," Naomi said. Celeste sighed, impatient rather than cruel, which in some ways was worse. "You don't get it. Dad's trying to keep this from becoming your whole identity." Naomi laughed once, not because anything was funny, because there are moments when a laugh is the only sound that keeps rage from becoming pleading. "My whole identity," she repeated. "You left your husband and moved back into your parents' house." Celeste's voice stayed maddeningly even. "I'm just saying maybe don't act like everyone else is the problem." It was not the harshest thing anyone had said to Naomi that season. It was the cleanest, because it revealed what had already happened in that family. They had turned her pain into evidence, not of what she had endured, of what she lacked. Naomi opened her eyes in the Chicago apartment and found that her coffee had gone lukewarm again. The memory did not dissolve when she returned to the present. It rarely did. It only shifted, becoming less immersive and more observational, as if part of her were now standing outside the younger woman she had been, grieving on her behalf with the steadiness she had not yet owned. She crossed to the living room and set the mug down beside a stack of market reports. Her phone lay face up on the coffee table, dark for the moment, peaceful looking, dishonest little object. Her reflection moved faintly in the windows. People like to think the worst damage in a family came from explosive things, screaming, betrayal, doors slammed hard enough to split wood. Naomi knew better. The deepest damage often came from repetition, from being shown, politely and consistently, that your failure made everyone around you uncomfortable in ways they expected you to correct for. That was what the Mercers had done. They had taught her to feel shame before she felt anger, to edit herself before anyone asked, to enter rooms already apologizing for whatever version of her life did not fit the family's preferred display. And now, after all these years, after everything she had built with those lessons, stripped out by force and practice and expensive trial and error, they wanted to place her under a banner and call her proof of renewal. Naomi picked up her phone. No new messages from them. Not yet. That, somehow, made it worse. The confidence of the move. The assumption that by the time they reached out, the deck would have already done part of the work. That seeing her name restored to theirs would soften something, confuse something, prime her. She moved back to the kitchen, rinsed the cup, and set it in the sink with a little more force than necessary. Then she stood there, palms against the counter, and said the truth out loud to the empty room. They were ashamed of me first. The sentence steadied her, not because it solved anything, because it named the original injury accurately. And when a thing is named accurately, it loses some of its right to haunt you in vague shapes. Outside, a train slid somewhere across the city, its sound softened by distance and glass. Naomi stayed where she was until the room went fully dark except for the skyline. Then she turned off the kitchen lights, checked the lock by habit, and walked down the hall toward her bedroom. Not calmer exactly, but clearer. There was a difference. And tonight, that was enough. Vivian called the next afternoon at 12:17, precisely in the narrow seam between Naomi's last internal meeting and the window she usually kept for lunch, but almost never used for lunch. Naomi was standing in her office, one hand braced on the back of her desk chair, reading through a preliminary memo Elias had sent over about unauthorized use of name and likeness, when her phone lit up with a number she still recognized before she registered it consciously: Indianapolis. For one irrational second, she considered letting it ring. Not because she was afraid of what her mother would say. That was the old story. This was newer, colder. She simply did not want to give Vivian Mercer the satisfaction of imagining she had entered Naomi's day naturally, as though this were a call between women who phoned each other often and without agenda. The phone buzzed again in her hand. Naomi answered, "Hello, Mom." A small silence. Then Vivian's voice arrived with the same polished softness it had always used in public-facing moments: fundraisers, condolence calls, church committee disputes disguised as concern. "Well," she said lightly, "that doesn't sound like someone who's happy to hear from her mother." Naomi looked out through the glass wall of her office into the corridor beyond. Two associates passed carrying binders, heads bent together over a spreadsheet. On the far end, Renee was speaking quietly to someone from compliance, her reflection steady in the conference room window. "I'm looking at a gala deck with my name on it," Naomi said. "So no, I wouldn't say happy is the first word that comes to mind." Vivian sighed, but it was the careful sigh of a woman placing herself on the side of reason. "Naomi, honestly, I thought you'd at least let me explain before you decided to be offended." There it was. Not apology, not acknowledgement. Offended. As if Naomi's reaction were the disproportionate thing in this equation. Naomi leaned back against the edge of her desk and let the silence stretch just long enough to make her mother hear it. "Then explain." Another tiny pause. Naomi could almost see Vivian recalibrating, one manicured hand resting beside a legal pad, chin tilted slightly down, eyes narrowing not in anger but in strategy. Her mother had always been most dangerous when she sounded least urgent. "We wanted to surprise you," Vivian said. Naomi let out one short breath through her nose. "By using my name without permission? It wasn't like that. It looks exactly like that." "You always do this," Vivian said, and now a little tension entered her voice, not enough to break the surface, but enough to cloud it. "You take a gesture and turn it into a legal argument before anyone has a chance to tell you what it meant." Naomi had to give her this. The line was efficient. It painted Naomi as clinical, defensive, impossible to reach. It made emotion look like a thing her mother had brought generously, only to have it slapped away. The problem for Vivian was that Naomi was no longer 26, standing half-ruined in a borrowed room, trying to prove she was still worth tenderness. She was 41, very well paid, and professionally trained to hear the structure underneath the language people used when they wanted outcomes without accountability. "What exactly did it mean?" Naomi asked. Vivian's answer came warm and ready. "It meant your family is proud of you." Naomi closed her eyes for half a second. Pride. What a convenient word. Spacious enough to be claimed after the fact. Decorative enough to cover old damage if spoken in the right tone. "I'm in the middle of a work day," Naomi said. "Say what you actually called to say." This time, the silence on the other end held longer. Then her mother shifted. "All right," Vivian said. "Come to Indianapolis. Let's have dinner tonight. Just us and your father and Celeste and Grant. No lawyers, no assistants, no drama. We can sit down like adults and talk this through." There were a dozen reasons to refuse. Naomi could name them in under 10 seconds, because the invitation had arrived too late. Because like adults was always the phrase families used when they wanted history excluded from the room. Because if Vivian truly wanted to talk this through, she could have started by asking permission before printing Naomi's name under a spotlight rendering. Because dinner in Indianapolis was not just dinner, it was geography. It was terrain chosen by people who still believed familiarity itself gave them the advantage. And yet Naomi did not say no, not immediately. Instead, she looked past her own reflection in the glass to the city beyond. Chicago in daylight was sharp-edged and unsentimental. It suited her. It asked her to be exact. "Where?" she asked. A quick inhale at the other end, small, but unmistakably pleased. "The Montclair room at Belmere," Vivian said. 7:30. Of course, not the house, not somewhere intimate enough to seem unplanned. Belmere was an old restaurant just outside downtown Indianapolis, one of those places with dark wood, impeccable service, and private dining rooms named after European cities. People held mergers there, engagement dinners, quiet reconciliations designed to be witnessed by exactly the right kind of staff and exactly the wrong kind of acquaintance if necessary. It was not a family dinner. It was staging. "I'll think about it," Naomi said. Naomi. Vivian lowered her voice on the last syllable, drawing concern across it like cashmere. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying." "Trying what?" Naomi almost asked, but she already knew. Not trying to repair, trying to position. "I'll let you know," she said, and hung up before her mother could smooth the conversation into something prettier than it was. For a moment, she stayed very still. Then she stepped out of her office and crossed the corridor toward the conference room where Renee had just finished. Renee looked up at once. "That was them?" "My mother." Naomi closed the door behind her. "Dinner invitation. Tonight." Renee's brows lifted a fraction. "That was quick." "Not quick enough." Naomi told her the details. Renee listened without interrupting, one hip against the edge of the conference table, a yellow legal pad tucked under her arm. She wore a charcoal dress and a thin gold chain at the throat, nothing dramatic, but she had that quality some women had in rooms like this, an economy of presence that made everyone else seem slightly over-designed. When Naomi finished, Renee said, "You're going." It was not phrased as a question. Naomi looked at her. "Am I?" Yes. Renee set the legal pad down. Not because they deserve it, because they've already moved without your consent once, which means they'll keep moving until something stops them. Right now, they think this is narrative management. If you don't walk in and see how organized they are, you'll be responding blind. That was one of the reasons Naomi had kept Renee as close as she had. She was not sentimental about power. She respected it too much to romanticize it. Naomi glanced at the clock on the wall. 12:29. If I go, she said, I'm not going home. Good. I fly in and out. Better. Naomi folded her arms. And if this turns into a guilt parade? Renee's mouth shifted, not quite a smile. Then at least you'll know what kind of theater you're in. By 4:30, Naomi was on a plane. It was a short flight, barely long enough to move through the first layer of anger into something more analytical. She spent the first 20 minutes going over the deck again on her tablet, this time as if it belonged to a client crisis she had been brought in to assess. Tone, nostalgic. Objective, restore trust. Primary mechanism, visual family legitimacy. Risk, unauthorized association with third-party credibility. That last part was her. Outside the oval window, the Midwest spread beneath her in flat brown gold panels, the land already giving itself over to late fall. Naomi had spent years thinking, distance made certain places smaller. It didn't. It only changed what they had access to. Indianapolis greeted her with low clouds and that familiar muted light that always made the city seem as though it had agreed not to draw too much attention to itself. A car was waiting because Belmere's private room bookings came with valet arrangements for special guests, which told Naomi more than she wanted to know about how fixed this evening already was in their minds. She checked into a hotel downtown rather than at one of the family-adjacent places north of the city. A fresh room, anonymous carpet, no photographs on the walls anyone would ever remember. She changed into a black silk blouse and slate trousers, nothing remotely dinner daughter about them. She left her coat unbuttoned. At 7:24, she stepped into Belmere. The hostess knew her name before she gave it. "Ms. Mercer," she said with polished ease, "they're expecting you." Of course they were. She followed the hostess past the bar, where low amber lamps threw flattering light over men in sport coats and women leaning into stemware. At the end of the corridor, the Montclair room door stood half open. Naomi saw Grant first. He rose from his seat at the far side of the table with the clean, practiced movement of a man who had spent enough time in boardrooms to understand exactly how much warmth to project and where. Grant Wynn had the kind of face that did well in annual reports. Bluntly handsome, controlled, forgettable in pieces, but persuasive in whole. Dark hair gone silver at the temples, navy jacket, open collar, no tie. He looked less like family than like a CEO trying to reassure skittish capital. "Naomi," he said, crossing toward her with his hand already extended. "I'm glad you came." "Not we're glad. I'm glad. Smart. Isolate. Personalize. Make yourself the reasonable conduit." Naomi shook his hand once. "Grant!" Behind him, Celeste stood. Naomi had not seen her sister in nearly 3 years, not close enough to register the updates. Time had sharpened her rather than softened her. The softness of early beauty had narrowed into something more deliberate, cheekbones cleaner, hair cut to a glossy shoulder-length curve, posture exact. She wore cream silk and small diamond hoops, and the expression of someone prepared to play gracious hostess in a room that technically belonged to no one and emotionally belonged to her. "Wow," Celeste said, coming forward with both arms opening as if the distance between them had merely been scheduling. "Look at you." And before Naomi could decide whether to step back or turn sideways, Celeste hugged her, not tightly, not lovingly, professionally. Naomi felt it instantly, the calibration of it. Long enough to read as warm if seen, light enough to remain deniable if rejected. As Celeste drew back, Naomi caught movement in the hallway mirror opposite the door. a man with a camera lifting it for half a second, then lowering it as though he had only been checking settings. There it was, not subtle enough to be accidental, not blatant enough to confront without sounding difficult. A candid, a family moment, evidence. Naomi looked at Celeste. Celeste smiled as if butter wouldn't melt on her. Vivian rose next, all soft, dove gray and pearls, her face composed into maternal relief. Dale remained seated until Naomi had crossed the threshold, then stood with measured dignity, as though he were receiving someone important enough to merit protocol, but not feeling. "Naomi," he said. "Dad." No one mentioned the deck, not for the first 4 minutes. That was part of the design. Water offered. Menus declined because selections had already been made. A remark from Vivian about Naomi looking thin, which in Mercer language was intended as affectionate. Grant asking about Chicago in the tone of a man gathering pre-conversation weather data. Celeste complimenting Naomi's earrings while scanning her blouse, watch, shoes, taking inventory, as always, beneath the sister act. The room itself was perfect for the kind of fiction they wanted to tell. Paneled walls, a round table set for 5, low candlelight. One abstract floral arrangement in the center, privacy that felt expensive rather than intimate. Naomi sat and understood, with a cold clarity she almost admired, that this dinner had been arranged as a controlled environment. Neutral ground masquerading as family ground, elegant enough to discourage scenes, small enough to create the illusion of sincerity. Grant was the one who finally opened the actual conversation. He set down his wine glass, folded his hands lightly near his plate, and said, "I'll be direct, because I know you prefer that." Naomi nearly smiled. "Do I?" she thought. "Or do you just need me to because it makes what comes next easier to package?" "We've had a difficult year," he said. There it was, Mercer and Wynn. He spoke of it with executive restraint, but the message underneath was clear enough. The company had lost 2 strategic investors. Press inquiries had increased after several former employees began speaking, off the record, of course, about internal culture problems. A rebrand was underway, but rebrands alone did not steady markets when trust had already begun to leak. And so the gala mattered, not merely as a celebration of 50 years, as a signal to investors, press, suppliers, regional business leadership, a renewal chapter. Naomi listened without interrupting. Grant did not ask for money. That would have been vulgar and, more importantly, ineffective. He was too sophisticated for that. What he asked for was something else entirely. Presence, a speech, a few words about legacy, about family, about resilience, about what it meant, in his phrasing, for the strongest among us to come back and stand with what built them. It was almost elegant if you ignored the violence beneath it. Vivian reached for her water as if she were moved by the thought. Celeste lowered her gaze at exactly the right moment. Dale said nothing, perhaps because his silence still carried the authority of old rooms. Naomi looked from one face to the next. The realization did not come like a shock. It settled. This was not reconciliation. This was an audition. They were not asking Naomi to return because they missed her, or because regret had finally cracked open something in them that age and pride had long protected. They wanted to see whether she could still be positioned, whether she could be recast, not as the embarrassment, not as the vanished daughter, but as the polished proof that Mercer and Wynn remained intact enough to produce a woman like her. Grant was still speaking, something about market confidence and family continuity. Naomi let him finish. Then she placed her napkin beside her untouched plate, folded her hands in her lap, and understood with total certainty that every gentle word in that room had a line item attached to it. That was where the evening truly began. Naomi did not refuse them at the table. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Grant. He had expected resistance. She could see that much in the way he held himself. What he had not expected was restraint. A clean, unemotional response left him with nothing to manage. If she had raised her voice, he could have softened his. If she had called the whole performance insulting, Vivian could have stepped in with wounded maternal grace and redirected the room toward healing. But Naomi did neither. She let Grant finish his careful speech about a difficult year, about visibility and continuity, and what it meant for a business to weather a season of misunderstanding. Then she reached for her water, took one measured sip, and said, "You've already used my name without permission. I'm not agreeing to anything tonight." No one moved. The candle in the center of the table burned steadily between them. The flame reflected in Grant's glass and in the silver rim of Vivian's untouched wine. Naomi set the glass down. "If you want to discuss whether my name appears anywhere connected to your event," she said, "that discussion starts with the fact that it should never have been there in the first place." Grant's jaw tightened so briefly another person might have missed it. He was too well trained to lose the room entirely, but not well enough to hide the fact that her language had pulled this out of the realm of family persuasion and back into the colder territory of permission, liability, and documented choice. Vivian leaned in before he could answer. "No one was trying to exploit you," she said, her voice low and almost hurt. "We wanted to honor you. There's a difference." Naomi looked at her mother and, for the first time that evening, felt almost nothing. Not numbness, clarity. Vivian was still beautiful in the way some women became beautiful with age by doubling down on discipline. Her pearl earrings sat exactly where they should. Her lipstick had not moved. Her expression was soft enough to invite sympathy from anyone who had not spent a lifetime watching her use softness as cover. "You don't honor people by volunteering them," Naomi said. Across the table, Celeste shifted, crossing one silk-clad leg over the other. "No one is saying the rollout was perfect." That almost made Naomi laugh. Not because it was funny, because it was such an elegantly Celeste line. Take a moral trespass, sand it into a messaging issue, and offer just enough critique to sound sophisticated without surrendering the thing itself. "Roll out," Naomi repeated. Celeste's mouth tightened. "You know what I mean." "I do," Naomi said. "That's the problem." Dale finally entered the conversation then, not loudly, but with the grave impatience of a man who believed discussion became unnecessary once he had spoken. "This doesn't need to become adversarial," he said. "Grant is trying to stabilize a company with 50 years of history behind it. We thought it was time the family presented itself as united." Naomi turned toward him. There had been years when one sentence from her father could still pull her back into the old reflex, to explain, to soften, to make herself sound less difficult than he was prepared to describe her. That reflex was gone now, and its absence felt less like strength than like the removal of a long-standing splinter. "You thought it was time," she said, "for the family to present itself as united." Dale held her gaze. "Yes." Naomi nodded once, slow and expressionless, as if she were confirming a detail in a file. "That tells me everything I need to know." The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was worse. It was tidy. A server entered, carrying plates no one had asked for in the last 5 minutes. Sea bass for Vivian, steak for Grant, pasta for Celeste. Belmere's staff moved with the polished discretion of people trained to behave as though private discomfort were simply another course to be cleared around. Naomi looked at her own untouched plate when it was set in front of her and felt suddenly tired, not emotionally, but structurally, as if the whole evening had been built out of materials she had once mistaken for family and now recognized only as strategy. She pushed her chair back. "I'll have my counsel be in touch," she said. Grant stood immediately. "Naomi, come on." That finally was the first honest note of the evening. Not warmth, not regret, friction. She looked at him. "No." It landed harder because she did not raise her voice. Vivian's face altered by half a degree, sorrow shading into caution. "Naomi, don't do this." "Do what?" Naomi almost asked. Name the room correctly? Instead, she picked up her coat and said, "I'm already doing less than you've earned." Then she left. The hallway outside the Montclair room was cooler than the dining room, and for a strange second, Naomi had the sensation of surfacing from underwater without having realized she'd been holding her breath. She did not look back. She passed the man with the camera near the bar and kept walking, giving him nothing else to collect. By the time she was in the back seat of the town car returning downtown, the anger she had expected was not what arrived. What arrived instead was a level, sharpened resolve, not because they had surprised her. They hadn't, because they had confirmed themselves so completely. By the next morning, she was back in Chicago. Rain had come in overnight, flattening the city into a gray sheen. Her office windows were stippled with it. Below, the river moved like dull metal. Renee was already in the conference room when Naomi arrived, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, a tablet open before her, and a paper cup of tea sitting untouched by one hand. She looked up as Naomi entered. "Well?" Naomi set her bag down on the table. It was exactly what it looked like. Renee's expression didn't change, but something in it settled. Confirmation. Naomi gave her the bones of the evening, Grant's framing, Dale's united family, the camera in the hallway, the fact that they never once treated permission like the central issue. Renee listened the way she always did, without interruption, without artificial outrage, making space for the useful parts to surface. When Naomi finished, Renee slid the tablet across the table. "This came in at 7:06, she said. "One of the outside event vendors forwarded it by mistake while trying to chase final approvals." On the screen was an email chain, not the glossy deck, not the language meant for sponsors and invited guests, the working thread beneath it. Naomi stood still while she read. There, 3 weeks earlier, was Grant's name attached to the final approval line for the materials package. He had reviewed the speaker order, approved the family legacy segment, and signed off on the exact phrasing that placed Naomi at the center of it. No misunderstanding, no overzealous marketing assistant, no consultant improvising with old public bios. Intent. Naomi read the timestamp twice, then once more. "He knew," she said. Renee folded her arms. "Yes." Naomi looked back at the chain. There was something almost obscene about how ordinary it was. Not a villain's note, not some reckless confession, just calm corporate language wrapped around a private act of appropriation, approved as drafted. Please proceed to print proofs. Need alignment on family messaging before distribution. Family messaging. Naomi gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Of course he did." Renee tilted her head. "Elias is drafting options. Limited demand, broader cease and desist posture, preservation notice, all of it. But before he sends anything, there's something else." Naomi looked up. Renee glanced toward the glass wall, then back. "You got a call this morning from an Indiana number while you were in transit. I didn't answer, obviously, but she left a message with reception. Said her name was Marlene Pike. Said if you were really Naomi Mercer from Meridian Kessler, she had a feeling you might want to hear from someone who remembered Hawthorne." For a moment, Naomi did not move. Hawthorne. The country club name fell into the room with an old, unpleasant weight. Renee studied her face. "You know her?" "Not well," Naomi said slowly. "She used to run events there years ago." "She called twice." Naomi walked back to her office to make the call. Marlene answered on the first ring, as though she had been expecting the phone to light any minute. Her voice had the flattened, practical cadence of women who had spent years managing impossible donors and worse husbands. Naomi remembered her only vaguely at first, a tall woman always moving quickly through dining rooms in black jackets, hair pulled back so hard it seemed to sharpen her face. But as soon as Marlene began speaking, the memory arranged itself. "I saw the Mercer name in the business journal," Marlene said, "and then I heard they were doing some big anniversary gala, and I thought, well, if they've dragged you back into it, somebody ought to tell you what I should have said a long time ago." Naomi sat down slowly. "What do you mean?" Marlene did not circle the point. She told Naomi that after the Hawthorne dinner all those years ago, the literacy event, the terrace, The donor crowd with their soft voices and sharp eyes. Celeste had stayed behind in the ballroom after Naomi went outside. Not quietly, not privately. She had moved from table to table, stopping near the women who ran boards, chaired charitable committees, or had daughters just old enough to be interested in networking circles. And with the smooth urgency of someone protecting the family image, Celeste had explained Naomi away. That she was having a hard time, that she was so intense lately, that she did not always understand how she came across. At one point, according to Marlene, Celeste had laughed lightly and said, Naomi doesn't really need support so much as she needs someone who can handle her, which apparently is a very short list. The line had landed the way those lines always did, in the exact place where cruelty could still pass as wit. Naomi closed her eyes. There it was. Not just shame in private, but narrative management in public. Even then, Marlene kept going. A local women's mentorship circle had been discussed that evening. One of the board wives had floated Naomi's name as someone who might benefit from being introduced to a regional development network. By dessert, that possibility had evaporated, not because anyone said no directly. Because the room had already been prepared to see Naomi as volatile, proud, difficult to place. She didn't scream at anybody, Marlene said. That's what made it stick. She said it like she was cleaning up after you. When the call ended, Naomi stayed still for a long moment, hands still wrapped around the phone. Then it rang again. This time it was Elias. He was not dramatic by nature. That was one of his better qualities. Elias Boone was the kind of attorney who looked less like litigation and more like a professor who had accidentally become expensive. Wire-rimmed glasses, patient eyes, jackets that never quite lost the memory of being folded over a chair. He was useful precisely because he did not waste energy performing certainty. When he had something worth saying, he said it plainly. I've had an inbound contact, he told Naomi. Former HR executive from Mercer and Wynn, name's Tessa Holloway. She reached out through LinkedIn first, then sent documentation summary notes this morning. I haven't engaged fully yet, but I thought you should know. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Why now? Because, Elias said, she thinks the gala is cover. An hour later, Tessa was on a secure video call from what looked like a home office lined with bankers' boxes and too many plants. She was around 50, with close-cropped silver-brown hair and the alert, unadorned face of someone who had spent a career being the adult in rooms full of polished excuses. She wore no visible makeup, only reading glasses she kept taking on and off as if she resented needing them. Tessa did not flatter Naomi. Naomi liked her immediately for that. She explained in careful, broad strokes that Mercer and Wynn's problem was not merely money. Investors could forgive a bad quarter. They were much slower to forgive a company that looked trapped in old governance habits while publicly pretending to evolve. There had been settlements with older female employees pushed out under the language of restructuring, quiet complaints about culture, executive decisions routed through family loyalty instead of process, a board increasingly aware that appearances were carrying more weight than reform. And now, Tessa said, they're building a public renewal story around the image of a successful woman from inside the family. She let that hang. They don't just need you on stage, she added. They need you next to them. That's different. After the call, Chicago felt sharper somehow. Naomi stood by the window in her office while rain moved down the glass in thin, clean lines. Below her, the city was busy with ordinary ambition, deliveries, meetings, people moving between buildings carrying coffee and deadlines and reasons no one else would ever fully know. Behind her, on the conference room table, sat the chain of emails proving Grant had approved her name. In her call log, Marlene Pike had just confirmed that years ago, Celeste had helped sand her into a story small enough for polite women to accept, and Tessa Holloway had handed her the clearest truth of all. This was never just about a speech. They needed a woman like Naomi beside them, so no one would look too closely at what kind of company they had been to women who had less power, less visibility, and nowhere equally prestigious to stand afterward. Naomi looked out at the river and understood, at last, the full shape of the thing. Her family did not want her back. They wanted her standing close enough to make the past look cleaner. Vivian came on a Friday morning when Chicago was bright enough to feel expensive. The sun had burned off the last of the rain from the day before, leaving the city scrubbed and sharply outlined, every window across the river flashing silver whenever the light shifted. Naomi had been at her desk since 7:30, working through a restructuring brief for a restaurant group in Milwaukee, when Renee appeared in the doorway of her office and said with unusual care, "Your mother is downstairs." Naomi looked up. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. Renee stepped inside and closed the glass door behind her. She didn't come through reception in a dramatic way. She asked for you by full name, gave security her ID, and said she was in town for only a few hours. A beat. "She's carrying a box." Naomi leaned back in her chair. Of course she was. Not flowers. Flowers would have been too easy to interpret. Not papers. Papers would have looked transactional. A box suggested memory. Preservation. Sentiment so concrete, it had to be carried in both hands. "Did she say what she wants?" Naomi asked. Renee's expression was dry. "You," Naomi almost smiled. Outside the office, phones rang in the controlled, muffled rhythm of a workplace that knew how to look calm under pressure. Down the hall, someone laughed once and quickly stopped. It was an ordinary business morning, the kind Naomi trusted most. Structured, demanding, uninterested in family mythology. "She can wait in the smaller conference room," Naomi said. Renee didn't move. "Do you want me in there?" The question was practical, not protective. Renee understood the difference. Naomi appreciated that more than she could say. "No," Naomi said after a second. "Not at first." Renee nodded. "I'll have coffee sent in and make sure no one interrupts unless you text me." When she left, Naomi sat still for a moment, palms flat on the desk. She had expected pressure after Marlene's call, after Tessa, after the dinner at Belmere failed to produce the version of her compliance the family had clearly hoped for. What she had not expected was this specific escalation. Vivian in Chicago, in Naomi's office, carrying something old enough to imply love and recent enough to imply effort. It was, Naomi had to admit, well chosen. By the time she entered the conference room, her mother was already standing by the window. Vivian Mercer did not look misplaced in corporate spaces. She never had. She wore a camel coat over a cream blouse, pearl studs in her ears, her hair smoothed into the same soft shape Naomi associated with board luncheons and holiday photographs and careful disappointment. The box sat on the table between two untouched water glasses, wrapped not in gift paper but in pale tissue, as though its contents were too fragile for ordinary presentation. When Vivian turned, her face opened into something that might have looked like relief to anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime learning how controlled relief could be. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. Naomi stayed standing for a beat longer than necessary before taking the seat opposite her. "You came without asking." Vivian accepted that without flinching. "If I'd asked, you would have said no." "Maybe." "No," Vivian said gently. "You would have." That landed more honestly than most of what she had said lately, which made Naomi dislike it on instinct. A young assistant knocked once, brought in coffee, and left. The door clicked shut. For a few seconds, neither woman touched the cups. Then Vivian placed one hand lightly on the box. "I found these last week," she said. "I was going through the linen closet upstairs." Naomi looked at the box and said nothing. Vivian lifted the tissue back. Inside were objects Naomi recognized before she fully saw them, which was its own kind of violence. A school pin from 8th grade debate, a folded program from her college scholarship ceremony, a photograph of Naomi at 17 in a navy blazer, half smiling into the sun, the expression on her younger face uncertain and defiant at once. Beneath them, tucked into the corner, was a card written in Vivian's unmistakable hand, the neat, upright penmanship of a woman who believed messiness was a form of character failure. For a second, Naomi forgot to breathe. Not because the items were especially grand. They weren't. That was precisely the problem. They were small things, private things, evidence that someone, somewhere in that house, had once kept track of her. Vivian watched her carefully. "I kept more than you think," she said. Naomi reached into the box and picked up the scholarship program. The paper had yellowed slightly at the fold. On the front, the university crest was still faintly embossed. She remembered that day, not in a warm rush, in fragments, heat, hairspray, the strange stiffness of the dress she'd worn because it looked appropriate in photographs. She remembered scanning the audience, not finding her parents until the end, and then spending years telling herself it had been enough that they came at all. She set the program down. "You didn't bring this here for nostalgia," she said. Vivian's gaze softened, or appeared to. "Can I have 10 minutes before you cross-examine me?" Naomi almost answered sharply. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and let her mother have the illusion. Vivian began talking. Not about the gala, not about Grant, not about damage control or family messaging. She spoke about the old house, about cleaning out closets, about the way certain things had survived moves from one room to another because she could never quite throw them away. Her voice stayed low and even, the voice she used when she wanted to create the feeling that what mattered was not the content of the conversation, but the intimacy of it. She picked up the card and slid it across the table. Naomi opened it. Inside, in blue ink that had faded at the edges, was a note from the day Naomi won her scholarship. "We are proud of how hard you work. Love, Mom." The words were brief enough to feel almost accidental. Naomi stared at them longer than she meant to. A dangerous thing, to be offered a scrap of tenderness from the exact archive where you had once gone looking for proof that you were loved correctly and come up short. Vivian must have seen something shift in her face because when she spoke again, her own voice changed too. Not dramatically, just enough. "I know I didn't handle everything well," she said. "I know there were times you needed something from me and I gave you the wrong thing." Naomi looked up. It wasn't an apology, not quite. Too carefully shaped, too allergic to specifics, but it was closer than Vivian usually came. The trouble with mothers like Vivian was not that they never told the truth. It was that they almost always told it in a form that preserved their own dignity. "You gave me silence," Naomi said. Vivian blinked, then lowered her eyes to the box. "I thought if I stayed calm, things wouldn't get worse." They got worse anyway. A small line appeared between Vivian's brows. Her expression held real feeling now, or something close enough to make no practical difference in the moment. "When you came home after the divorce," she said, "I didn't know how to reach you. You were so shut down." Naomi laughed once, softly. There it was again, the old family instinct. Not what was done to her, the way she had responded to being wounded. Vivian heard the laugh and took it for invitation, or pretended to. "We are not easy women, Naomi," she said. "The Mercer women never have been. You, me, even Celeste in her own way. We survive by hardening in places we shouldn't." She paused. "I see that now more than I used to." It was an intelligent line, smart enough to flatter Naomi, smart enough to make shared womanhood sound like reconciliation rather than strategy. And for one dangerous second, it worked. Not completely, but enough that Naomi felt the old hunger stir, the humiliating one she hated most, the part of her that still, against all evidence and training and time, wanted her mother to say one clear thing without varnish. "I should have protected you." Instead, Vivian reached for her coffee, took the smallest sip, and set the cup down with exact care. "People are looking at our family," she said quietly. The room changed, not all at once, the way weather changes when a cloud passes over sun. Naomi did not move. Vivian continued, "The company is in a vulnerable position. You know that now." There it was, not sprung too soon. Not crudely, introduced only after memory had softened the edges of the table, after old objects had been laid between them like stepping stones, after Naomi had been made to touch her own childhood with her bare hands. Vivian's eyes lifted to meet hers. "And the truth is," she said, "the world sees things symbolically. It shouldn't, but it does. A family that can stand together matters. A daughter who is willing to stand beside what shaped her matters." Naomi leaned back slowly. So that was the architecture. Not false sentiment exactly. Something more efficient. Sentiment used as solvent. Soften the old scar tissue, then slide the request underneath. Vivian must have seen the temperature in Naomi's face drop because she rushed to refine it. "I'm not saying this to use you," she said. "I'm saying it because people need to see that women in this family can stand with one another, that we are not—" She searched for the word, then chose one that was meant to wound less by sounding abstract. "Fractured." Naomi looked at the box again, at the pin, the program, the note in blue ink, at all the little pieces of herself her mother had preserved just carefully enough to one day lay them out as evidence that love had existed and might therefore be owed a return. When she spoke, her voice was almost conversational. "You brought me my own life," she said, "so you could ask for my face." Vivian flinched, only slightly, but enough. "That's unfair." "No," Naomi said. "It's precise." Outside the conference room, the office moved on. Someone rolled a cart past the glass wall. A printer started somewhere down the hall. The world, blessedly, had not arranged itself around this conversation. Vivian's hand tightened over the edge of the tissue paper. "I came here because I thought we might finally talk as women instead of as opponents." Naomi held her gaze. "Then you should have come with empty hands." For the first time that morning, her mother had no immediate answer. The silence that followed did not feel victorious. It felt exact. After a moment, Naomi stood. She slid the scholarship program and the card back into the box, then folded the tissue over them with more care than she wanted her mother to see. "You can leave the box," she said, "but not the argument." Vivian rose more slowly. For one strange second, Naomi thought she might say something real before leaving, something stripped of phrasing, stripped of aim. But Vivian only reached for her coat and said, very softly, "I don't think you understand how much is at stake." Naomi walked to the door and opened it. "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said, and she did. That was the most unbearable thing of all. By Sunday evening, Crowley House looked like the kind of place people chose when they wanted history without having to survive any of its inconveniences. The hotel had been standing in some form for nearly a century, though most of what passed for age inside it had been polished, replastered, and rewired into something more profitable. Its limestone front glowed under the wash of uplighting. Valets moved in practiced arcs beneath the porte cochere. Through the tall windows of the ballroom level, Naomi could already see the amber drift of chandeliers and the pale sweep of linen-covered tables. Mercer and Wynne had chosen the building well. It suggested continuity, refinement, the kind of respectable endurance Midwestern family businesses like to wrap around themselves when the books had become less persuasive than the branding. If the gala worked, no one would leave talking about severance agreements or board unease or the careful email language around family messaging. They would leave saying the company still had roots, that it still had class, that it had managed somehow to put its best daughter back in the room. Naomi stepped out of the Blacktown car and looked up at the banner inside the entry hall. Mercer and Wynne, at 50, craft, legacy, renewal. The words did not sting this time. They clarified. Renee came around the other side of the car at the same moment Elias emerged from behind her, adjusting the cuff of his navy coat with that absent-minded precision he had whenever he was thinking 2 legal steps ahead. Naomi had not invited them as emotional support. The distinction mattered. Renee was there because she understood systems and optics better than anyone Naomi knew. Elias was there because if anyone from Mercer and Wynne attempted in real time to blur consent into family expectation again, he would be the person who knew exactly how to name it. Renee looked up at the facade, then at the banner, and said, "Subtle." Naomi's mouth moved, not quite a smile. They've never believed in waste. Renee wore black, as always, when she wanted to disappear and dominate at the same time. Clean lines, no nonsense, gold hoops, hair pinned back. She could have passed for a chief of staff, a crisis strategist, or the woman who quietly inherited the company after the men ruined it. Elias beside her carried a folded overcoat and the mild academic face that still made strangers underestimate how dangerous he was once they began lying in front of him. "You don't have to stay a minute longer than you want," he said. "I know." Naomi did know. That was the point. Inside, the event had already begun its work. The foyer held a registration table dressed in cream roses and low candlelight. 2 junior staffers in black greeted guests with printed name tags and polished smiles. At the far wall, an oversized timeline displayed 50 years of Mercer and Wynn history in sepia photographs and clean captions. Founders, workshops, flagship commissions, old magazine mentions, charity partnerships, all the usual landmarks of selective memory. A photographer moved through the room with the airy predation of someone hired to make people look pleased with themselves. Naomi caught in the edge of her vision the double take of recognition before she heard her own name spoken. Not loudly, not yet, but enough. There she is. She didn't stop. That was one thing she had learned after enough years inside elegant rooms. If you walked like you belonged entirely to yourself, people often mistook that for belonging to the event. The ballroom doors stood open. Beyond them, round tables glowed beneath chandeliers the color of diluted honey. The stage at the far end held a lectern, 2 armchairs, and a screen where the Mercer and Wynn logo rotated through a loop of archival images. The room had that expensive hush large gatherings acquired just before dinner was fully underway, a low weave of silverware, fabric, glass, and people rehearsing the versions of themselves they wanted photographed. Naomi scanned once and found them immediately. Grant near the stage, speaking to a man Naomi recognized from a regional private capital firm. Celeste near table 7, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair as she laughed at something a woman in emerald satin had said. Vivian in pale gray turned 3/4 toward a retired judge's wife Naomi dimly remembered from another lifetime. Dale standing with an old donor whose expression suggested he was prepared to be reassured if reassurance was served well enough. For one suspended second, none of them saw her. The effect was almost educational. This was the family in its preferred habitat, composed, social, coherent from a distance. Not the people who had sat in Belmere and discussed her name like a recoverable asset. Not the woman who had carried a box of childhood relics into a Chicago office and laid them on the table like tender collateral. Just a successful legacy business and the people best positioned to look like its moral architecture. Then Celeste turned. Even from across the room, Naomi saw the exact moment her sister registered 3 things at once. Naomi had come, Naomi had not come alone, and Naomi was not dressed for any version of reconciliation that required softness. Celeste excused herself from her cluster and crossed the room with practiced warmth already gathering on her face. "Naomi," her voice was pitched to be overheard just enough. "I'm so glad you made it." She leaned in for a kiss at the cheek that Naomi did not quite allow. It transformed, mid-motion, into a near embrace without enough awkwardness to be called a miss. Celeste recovered cleanly. Of course she did. "You look amazing," Celeste said. "So do you." It was true, and Naomi disliked that it was true. Celeste in crisis looked even more like herself, not less. Champagne silk, a narrow gold bracelet, hair smooth and shining beneath the ballroom lights. She had always known how to make composure look like virtue. Her eyes flicked to Renee and Elias. "I didn't realize this was a team arrival," Renee answered before Naomi had to. "It's a public event," she said evenly. "Seemed appropriate." Celeste's smile held, but only because women like her had trained every facial muscle with intention. "Well," she said lightly, "we're all just trying to get through the evening." There were 10 possible responses. Naomi chose the one that gave away nothing. I imagine so. Grant joined them then, all smooth urgency and freshly applied welcome. Naomi. Grant. He glanced at Elias, assessed him in half a second, then at Renee, whose expression offered no opening. If he was rattled, he kept it behind the professional face he used for rooms exactly like this. You're here, he said. Good. It was the wrong word. Too revealing. Not thank you for coming. Not I'm glad to see you. Good, as if a variable had finally resolved in his favor. Naomi let it sit there between them. Grant corrected course. I'm glad we'll have a chance to reset the tone from the other night. We'll see what tone the room has earned, Naomi said, his smile thinned by a degree. Across the ballroom, Vivian had now seen them. Her body did not jerk or falter. She was too disciplined for that. But Naomi watched the news travel through her anyway, subtle as a current. She said something to the woman beside her, set down her glass, and began moving toward them. Naomi, she said when she arrived, and for a brief instant there was something in her face so nakedly hopeful, Naomi hated herself for noticing it. Then it was gone, smoothed beneath social polish. Thank you for coming. Naomi did not answer the thank you. I'm here, she said. Dale approached last, slower than the others, carrying the full old weight of his own certainty. He gave Naomi a nod that managed somehow to contain welcome, warning, and entitlement all at once. We're seated near the front, he said. There's a place for you. Naomi met his eyes. No, she said. There isn't. The sentence was quiet enough that only the four of them heard it clearly, but it landed with the hard neatness of cut glass. Grant opened his mouth, then shut it. A woman from the event staff appeared beside them, nervous and efficient. Mr. Wynn, we're ready for the remarks whenever you are. He looked at Naomi one last time, calculation now replacing charm. Whatever improvisation he had hoped for would have to wait. The room was already turning toward the stage. Excuse me, he said. He left. Celeste touched Vivian's arm lightly and moved after him, instinctively following the center of gravity. Dale remained another second, as if sheer paternal presence might still influence how Naomi arranged herself. When it didn't, he gave the smallest shake of his head and went too. Vivian was the last to step away. Please, she said softly, not quite looking at Renee or Elias. Don't make tonight uglier than it needs to be. Naomi held her gaze. Then you should have left my name off the program. Vivian flinched, not visibly enough for strangers, but enough for Naomi, and turned toward the stage. Naomi took a seat at a table halfway back. Not hidden, not central. Renee sat to her right, Elias to her left. Around them, the room settled into attention. Grant took the stage to applause. He was very good. Naomi gave him that much. He spoke with the calm, measured confidence of a man who knew which parts of a story needed to sound inevitable. He thanked partners, honored craftsmen, praised the company's history of design and integrity. He spoke of change without ever naming fault, resilience without ever defining what had been survived. 50 years, he said, was not only a marker of endurance, but an invitation to renewal. The screen behind him shifted through old workshop photographs and clean logo slides. At table 3, a donor nodded along. At table 6, a reporter Naomi recognized from local business coverage took a few brief notes. Then Grant did what Naomi had known he would do. He smiled into the room, opened one hand toward the audience, and said, and tonight, as we look ahead, I'm especially proud to welcome someone whose success reflects the strength of the values that shape this family and this company. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Mercer. The applause came quickly, warmly, before most of the room even had time to think. Some of it was reflex, some curiosity, some the easy generosity audiences extend toward names they've been primed to receive. Naomi stood. She could feel Renee go very still beside her. Elias did not move at all. Naomi walked to the stage without hurry. The ballroom looked different from up there, less intimate, more mechanical, tables flattened into pattern, faces brightened by chandeliers and expectation. At the front, Vivian sat with both hands clasped, her mouth controlled into something like calm. Celeste's smile had become too fixed. Dale looked carved from the old wood of the room itself. Grant stepped back from the lectern with that polished host's gesture that pretended nothing uncertain was happening. Naomi took her place behind the microphone. She did not touch the prepared note cards waiting there. For one heartbeat, maybe two, she simply looked at the room. Then she said, "Before I say anything else, I need to clarify something." The applause residue died instantly. "I am not a member of Mercer and Wynn's advisory leadership," she said. "I do not represent this company, and I did not authorize the use of my name in its promotional materials." No one moved. That was the first mercy of shock. It cleaned the room. Naomi heard somewhere near the back the soft, accidental clink of glass against plate. She went on, "I'm here tonight because I believe clarity matters, especially in rooms where image can easily start masquerading as truth." From the corner of her eye, she saw Grant take one half step forward, then stop when Elias rose from his seat, just enough to make his presence visible, and then sat again. Not a threat, a reminder. Naomi kept her hands resting lightly on either side of the lectern. "There are families," she said, "who only seem to discover the value of a woman once the rest of the world has already done the work for them. There are institutions that learn the language of renewal long before they learn the discipline of honesty. And there are moments when standing on a stage beside something is taken as proof that it helped build you." She let that sentence settle. "In my experience," she said, "those assumptions are often wrong." No shouting, no dossier. No spectacle. That was the thing none of them had understood. Naomi did not need to destroy the evening to take herself out of its architecture. She only needed to speak with enough precision that no one in the room could continue mistaking her presence for endorsement. At table 8, the reporter from the Business Journal was writing now without pretending otherwise. Naomi shifted, very slightly, away from the Mercer and Wynn logo glowing behind her. "I built my career in rooms where people use words like resilience and legacy all the time," she said. "Sometimes they mean those words. Sometimes they use them to avoid other ones. Accountability, repair, consent, change." Across the room, Vivian's face had gone still in the particular way Naomi recognized from childhood, the stillness that meant emotion was being pressed back behind image at tremendous speed. "And because I care about those distinctions," Naomi continued, "I want to use tonight to announce something that is mine to announce." Now the room leaned in. This, more than confrontation, was the language it understood: ownership, intent, direction. "Over the next year," Naomi said, "my firm will be launching the Second Ledger Initiative, an independent advisory and re-entry program for women whose careers have been disrupted by personal crisis, corporate restructuring, or the quiet ways institutions decide certain people are easier to remove than respect." A pause. "Not for drama, for clarity. We will be partnering with an independent network of advisors, including former human resources and organizational leaders, to provide strategic guidance, financial planning, and professional rebuilding support. The program has no affiliation with Mercer and Wynn." That last sentence was the cleanest blade of all. It severed without spectacle. Naomi did not look at her family as she said it. She looked at the room, at the women in it, some of whom had spent entire careers learning to survive polite erasure, at the men whose faces had shifted from comfortable reception to something more alert and evaluative, at the people who had come expecting a narrative of restored family harmony and were now being offered a different one entirely, a woman declining to be repurposed. "I believe in second chapters," Naomi said finally. "I just don't believe anyone else gets to write yours and hand it back to you as gratitude." She stepped away from the lectern. For one suspended second, the ballroom did not know what to do. Then, from somewhere near the middle, applause began. Not thunderous, not universal. Realer than that. A ripple, then another. A few people stayed perfectly still. A few joined late. A few, Naomi noticed, never took their eyes off Grant. He had the look of a man recalculating at speed while trying not to be seen doing it. Naomi descended the stage. No one stopped her. That was the second mercy of shock. By the time she reached her table, Owen Carlisle, local podcast host, business event scavenger, collector of public discomfort dressed up as civic curiosity, was already angling through the aisle with his phone in one hand and opportunity lighting his face from within. He was younger than Naomi expected up close, with careful stubble, a too expensive blazer, and the bright, carnivorous energy of a man who had built a career on arriving 1 second after other people lost control of theirs. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "do you have a comment on whether tonight's statement reflects a wider dispute with Mercer and Wynn leadership?" Elias stood before Naomi had to answer. "Not tonight," he said pleasantly. Owen pivoted, smiling as if pleasant refusal were merely another flavor of yes. "Would your client care to clarify whether she believes the company intentionally misrepresented her involvement?" Renee looked at him then, and whatever he saw in her face made him blink once. "My client?" Naomi said mildly. "That's interesting. I wasn't aware I'd hired you." The line landed harder than she intended, and a woman at the next table made the smallest involuntary sound that might have been a laugh badly disguised as a cough. Owen recovered, but less gracefully. Naomi did not wait for his next attempt. She picked up her clutch, nodded once to Renee and Elias, and turned toward the exit. As she crossed the ballroom, she passed table 3, where a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a donor badge half hidden beneath her shawl caught Naomi's eye and gave the tiniest nod. Respect, maybe. Or recognition. Naomi didn't need to know which. Near the stage, Celeste stood half-risen from her chair, color high in her face. Vivian had not moved at all. Dale looked like a man watching a building he thought he understood fail in a way he had not prepared for. Grant was already speaking in low, controlled tones to someone from the board. None of them called after her. That, too, was information. In the foyer, the air felt cooler. Renee touched Naomi's elbow lightly once they were through the doors. "You were right to keep it clean." Naomi exhaled. Only then did she realize how carefully controlled her breathing had been since Grant spoke her name into the microphone. "I wasn't trying to be clean," she said. "I was trying to be exact." Elias opened the door to the street. Outside, the night had gone fully cold. The city lights threw pale ribbons across the wet pavement. Behind them, inside the old hotel, the gala would keep going in some form. Dessert would still arrive. Someone would still thank sponsors. The chandeliers would continue flattering everyone equally, but the room they had built around Naomi no longer held her, and that was enough. The morning after the gala, Naomi woke before her alarm and lay still in the hotel bed for a full minute, listening to the old building breathe. Crowley House had the kind of silence that was never truly silent. Pipes shifted somewhere in the walls. An elevator door sighed open and shut down the hall. Beneath it all was the faint machinery of hospitality resetting itself for another day. Sheets changed, coffee delivered, crystal cleared, stories absorbed. Naomi stared at the ceiling and waited for the aftershock. It didn't come the way she expected. There was no cinematic rush of triumph, no shaking hands, no immediate collapse into tears. What she felt instead was something quieter and stranger, as though a room inside her that had been locked for years had finally been opened and found not empty, but aired out. Her phone was on the nightstand, face down. It had been buzzing in intervals since she left the ballroom. She reached for it. 23 unread texts, 6 voicemails, 2 emails from unfamiliar addresses, a message from Owen Carlisle's producer requesting a brief follow-up clarification for accuracy, 1 terse update from Elias sent at 12:11 a.m. "No need to respond to anything tonight. We hold position. Sleep if you can." Naomi almost smiled. Sleep if you can, as if sleep were a matter of scheduling. She sat up, pushed the duvet back, and opened the curtains. Indianapolis looked pale and undecided under a winter blue sky. The parking lot below still held traces of last night's rain, and the church spire 2 blocks over caught the light first, as if even now the city preferred its symbols intact. Her phone vibrated again. Celeste calling. Naomi let it ring out. Then almost immediately another notification appeared. Voicemail received. She put the phone down without listening. There was a time in her life when she would have listened instantly, not because she wanted to, but because she had been trained to believe that ignoring family was a form of escalation, while enduring them was maturity. That reflex had taken years to wear down. It had not vanished entirely, but it no longer ran her. She showered, dressed, and ordered coffee she barely tasted. By the time she was downstairs in the lobby, the hotel had already begun metabolizing the previous night. Staff moved with gentle discretion. Guests who had attended the gala greeted one another with the careful, too bright tone people used when they were not yet ready to admit they had witnessed something consequential. At checkout, the woman at the desk gave Naomi a smile that held half a beat too long. "Safe travels, Ms. Mercer." Naomi nodded once. "Thank you." No one said anything more. They didn't have to. Back in Chicago by early afternoon, she went straight to the office. Not because there was urgent work waiting, though there always was, but because she wanted fluorescent normalcy, the cold competence of glass walls and calendars and people whose expectations of her had been built on performance rather than blood. Renee was already there, coat off, sleeves rolled, scanning something on her laptop with the expression she reserved for problems she intended to reduce to size. She looked up as Naomi came in. "Well," she said, "the room has reacted." Naomi set her bag down. "How bad?" Renee turned the screen toward her. It wasn't catastrophic. That was the first thing Naomi noticed, and perhaps the most realistic. Mercer and Wynn had not burst into flames overnight. No front-page scandal headlines screamed collapse. That was never how these things worked in actual business communities, where money and reputation moved more carefully than outrage. But the shift was there. A regional trade publication had posted a short item summarizing the gala as unexpectedly tense, noting Naomi's public clarification and the announcement of her independent initiative. One investor had requested a delay on a pending conversation until leadership alignment is clearer. Another had not formally pulled out, but had asked for additional governance materials before moving forward. A board member Naomi didn't know by name had sent an internal message, forwarded to Elias by one of his contacts, asking why the company had allowed such a preventable optics failure to occur at its flagship event. Not a collapse, a withdrawal of easy confidence, exactly the kind of damage Mercer and Wynn would hate most. Not public humiliation, but hesitation. Naomi read quietly. Renee watched her over the edge of her own coffee cup. Grant's camp has not issued a public statement, yet. "They won't today," Naomi said. Renee's brows lifted. "No, no. If they respond too fast, they validate the fracture. If they wait, they can pretend they're taking the high road." Renee gave the smallest nod. "That was my read, too." Naomi handed the screen back. Only then did she listen to the voicemails. Celeste first. Her sister's voice arrived clipped and bright in the worst possible way, the sound of someone holding herself together by sheer indignation. "What the hell was that?" she said without preamble. "Do you have any idea what you did last night? You made us look insane in front of people who actually matter. This was supposed to be one night, Naomi. One night where you didn't make everything about your damage." Naomi stopped the message before the end, not because it hurt, because it bored her in a new way. Celeste had always mistaken narrative for truth. If the room looked unified, then the room was unified. If Naomi objected to being used, then Naomi had made it about herself. There was a kind of poverty in people like that, a permanent inability to imagine that another person's dignity might exist outside of how useful it was to the family image. The second voicemail was from Dale. He had waited longer before calling. Of course he had. Her father liked distance when distance helped him restore the moral high ground. When his voice came through, it was low and controlled, touched by the formal disgust he reserved for situations in which he believed decorum had been weaponized against him. "You humiliated this family in public," he said. "Whatever grievance you think you have, grown people handle those things privately. There were donors in that room, board members, community partners who have known this family for decades. You did not have to agree with the evening, but what you did was vindictive." Naomi listened to the whole message. That part mattered to her. She wanted to hear the architecture of it all the way through. Not once did he say her name had been used without consent. Not once did he ask whether she had been wronged. Only family, optics, decorum, public disgrace. By the time the voicemail ended, she felt not anger, but relief so clean it almost resembled gratitude. There it was again. Confirmation, stripped of sentiment. Dale had not changed. He had only aged. The text from Vivian arrived 2 days later. Not a call, not another visit, a text. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now to make you believe me." Naomi read it twice. There was, in those 14 words, the entire problem. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I see what I did." Not, "You were right." Just the gravitational center Vivian had always returned to when the surface cracked. Her own confusion, her own hurt, her own sense that she was standing before a locked door and being treated unfairly for not already having the key. Naomi did not answer. She put the phone down, looked out through the office glass at the corridor beyond, and understood something she should perhaps have understood years earlier. There were people who apologized because they had reached the truth. And there were people who asked what else they were supposed to do because they were still searching for the correct performance that would restore access. Vivian was the second kind. The week moved. That too surprised Naomi. She had expected the aftermath to consume everything, but actual life, with its complete lack of reverence for personal climax, kept arriving in invoices and staff meetings and a delayed construction update from Milwaukee. She signed papers. She approved a revised deck for a client. She spent 40 minutes on a call about a hotel kitchen redesign she did not care about but needed to understand. By Thursday, the gala had already begun its transformation into narrative, the thing people referenced in lowered tones, then more openly, then eventually with the confident hindsight reserved for events no one wanted responsibility for in real time. Mercer and Wynn did not implode, but it had been touched. That was enough. Late Friday evening, after the office emptied and the cleaning crew began their soft, respectful invasion of the floor, Naomi stayed behind with the lights low in her office and a legal pad in front of her. She had thought briefly about blocking all of them, then decided not to. Blocking would feel satisfying for an hour and inaccurate after that. What she wanted was not a dramatic severing. It was language, boundaries recorded in words too plain to be misinterpreted later. So she wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text, paper. Her handwriting at the beginning was tighter than usual. By the middle, it had steadied. She addressed it to the house in Indianapolis. Not to Vivian, not to Dale, not dear family, the house, the structure that had contained all of them and taught her what kind of silences people could live inside if they decorated them well enough. She wrote that she did not owe anyone in that family a healing scene designed to make them feel absolved. She wrote that her name, likeness, work, and story were not available for future use, socially, publicly, commercially, or emotionally, without her direct consent. She wrote that if anyone genuinely wished to have a relationship with her going forward, it would have to begin without strategy. No public setting, no business context, no prepared narrative, no implication that access to her was something recoverable through enough phrasing or pressure. And then she wrote the truest line of all: "If you ever come to me again, come with empty hands." When she finished, she did not cry. She read the letter once, corrected 2 words, and signed her name exactly as she used it now. Naomi Rowan Mercer. Not because they deserved the full shape of her identity, because she did. On Saturday morning, she mailed it herself. The post office near her building was nearly empty, the air inside dry with paper and winter coats. A man in work boots mailed 3 padded envelopes. An older woman asked too many questions about certified delivery. Naomi stood in line with her single white envelope and felt strangely unremarkable, which was its own kind of grace. The clerk took the letter, stamped it, and slid it into the outgoing bin without ceremony. That was all. No music, no witness, no dramatic weather. Just an ordinary act performed at the exact point when it became necessary. That night, Naomi stood in her apartment by the living room windows with a glass of water in one hand and the city spread below her in blue, black layers of light. Renee had gone home hours ago. Elias had sent a brief note confirming the company had received their formal non-use demand without response so far. Tessa had forwarded an early advisory draft for the second ledger initiative. Work was already moving toward what came next. Behind her, on the console table near the entryway, sat the box Vivian had left. Naomi had not opened it again. Maybe she would someday. Maybe not. Either way, it no longer had authority. She looked at the reflection in the glass, the dark silhouette of a woman standing upright in a room she paid for, in a city she chose, inside a life no one had handed her, and no one could now repurpose without permission. People often talked about cutting off family as if it were one decisive slash, one operatic moment of courage. It wasn't. Not usually. Sometimes it was only this, recognizing that what needed severing was not blood, not history, not even hope in its most abstract form. What needed severing was the old assumption that they could still reach into your life and use you. Naomi stood there until the water in her hand had gone room temperature. Then she turned off the lamp by the sofa, left the city in the windows, and walked down the hall toward bed with the clean, unadorned knowledge that she had finally stopped waiting for them to understand, and that more than anything she had said on a stage felt like freedom. What this story reminds me is that love should never require you to become smaller just to make other people comfortable. In real life, some of the hardest boundaries are not with strangers, but with the people who believe they still have a right to your name, your silence, or your success. Protecting your peace is not cruelty. Sometimes it is the most honest thing you can do. If this story stayed with you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to know what part hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Wishing you peace, clarity, and the courage to choose yourself when it matters most.